Daniel Marsh walked into the Ashcroft Crown Gala as the one man who could rescue the largest acquisition his company had ever been part of. But the CEO, Vivian Ashcroft, took one look at him and saw nothing more than a worn gray suit, a plain wristwatch, and the quiet detail that he was raising a daughter on his own. In front of hundreds of guests, she had his seating card switched and sent him down to the staff cafeteria as if he were a courier who had stumbled into the wrong hallway. Daniel didn't protest. He simply took a seat among the people that room had long since learned to overlook. Then a door swung open. Margaret Ashcroft, the woman whose name was carved above the entrance, pulled out the chair beside him and spoke 5 words that silenced the entire ballroom. After that night, nothing about Ashcroft Crown would ever look the same again. If you believe kindness should never be mistaken for weakness, stay with this one. What happens next to Vivian Ashcroft is the kind of reckoning most people spend entire careers trying to dodge. 10 hours before the gala, Daniel arrived at the glass tower housing Ashcroft Crown Hospitality for what he'd been told was the closing meeting on the Lakeshore acquisition, a deal worth more than $1 billion that would absorb an aging resort chain into the Ashcroft portfolio. The insurance underwriters had been unambiguous months earlier. Without certification from Marsh Grid Systems, the small engineering firm Daniel had built after losing his wife, none of the outdated resort properties could legally reopen. His patented system, called Guardian Mesh internally, was the only technology that could repair the resort's failing electrical infrastructure without shutting them down for a year of renovations. Ashcroft Crown needed him more than anyone in that building wanted to say aloud. They left him waiting in the hallway for nearly 40 minutes. Junior staff walked past without a glance, none pausing to ask who he was. When he was finally let in, Vivian didn't offer him a seat right away. She looked over his suit, the kind that had been mended rather than replaced, and asked her assistant, loud enough for him to hear, whether contractors were usually allowed in board-level meetings. Daniel calmly reminded her that Ashcroft Crown itself had brought him on as the deal's independent certifying engineer. Vivian finally pushed a revised contract across the table, one that would buy out his patents for a fraction of their value, force him to certify the resorts as safe before repairs were even complete, and bury a clause that would let the company quietly lay off its longtime maintenance crews once he signed. He read it twice and set it down without touching a pen. Vivian told him bluntly that a company his size had no leverage against Ashcroft Crown and suggested he think about his daughter's tuition before trying to be a hero. It was the first time that morning her contempt had landed on something personal. Still, his expression barely shifted. He told her he raised his daughter on honest work and he wouldn't use her future as an excuse to endanger thousands of hotel guests. Vivian smiled the way people smile when they think they've already won, and invited him to that evening's gala, telling him he still had a few hours to reconsider his position. As he left, Nathaniel Cross, the CFO, asked what would happen if Daniel refused to sign. Vivian answered without pause. By nightfall, he'd know exactly what it felt like to stand completely alone. The elevator ride down was lined with mirrored glass, and Daniel caught his own reflection repeated a dozen times as the doors closed. A tired man in a well-worn suit inside a building engineered to remind everyone how small they were. He thought, not the first time, that people raised in towers like this one often confused high ceilings with the size of their own judgment. Outside, lake wind cut across the plaza. He stood beneath the Ashcroft Crown sign a moment, letting the cold clear his head before reaching for his keys.
He'd learned in the months following his wife's diagnosis that anger rarely accomplished anything on its own, and that people who ran rooms like the one he'd just left were counting on him losing his composure first. He wasn't going to hand Vivian that win, not today, and not over a contract asking him to trade his name for her convenience. Daniel drove back to Marsh Grid Systems' modest second-floor office above an old repair shop, about as far from Ashcroft Crown's marble lobby as a place could be. The walls held no awards, only technical drawings, patent certificates, and handwritten thank-you notes from fire departments, hospitals, and hotels that trusted his system when it counted. His phone rang before he'd even set his bag down, his daughter Nora calling to ask if he still planned to attend the gala. He didn't mention that Vivian had used her tuition as leverage that morning. He only said the evening might decide the company's future. Nora, sharper than most people her age, reminded him after her mother died he'd turned down a well-paying job rather than leave her alone, and told him he didn't need to sacrifice his principles to keep protecting her anymore. The call was short, but it steadied him, reminding him exactly why this fight mattered. Afterwards, Daniel sat for a while in the quiet office, listening to the radiator tick against the cold seeping through old window frames. The place smelled faintly of solder and coffee, a scent tied to every late night he'd spent rebuilding his life after his wife's death, learning to be both parent and provider without complaint. On his desk sat a curled photograph of Nora at 8 years old, standing beside the first sensor prototype he'd ever built in that very room. It reminded him, on nights like this, that the company had never been about proving anything to men like Nathaniel Cross or women like Vivian Ashcroft. It had always been about building something honest enough that her daughter would never doubt the kind of man her father chose to be.
Before he left, Daniel pulled up the digital archive where Marsh Grid Systems filed its safety assessments and found that 3 critical warning reports sent to Ashcroft Crown had vanished from the shared portal. The documents Nathaniel had forwarded to underwriters carried identical file numbers, but different language. Severe electrical hazards quietly downgraded to routine maintenance notes. Daniel understood then that the gala was never meant to be a negotiation. It was a stage meant to surround him with wealth and power until he felt small enough to sign whatever was placed in front of him. He decided to go anyway, not to plead his case, but to watch closely and see who already knew the truth behind the altered files. He copied every original document to an encrypted drive, sent a duplicate to his attorney, and locked up for the night, calm in the knowledge that a written truth doesn't vanish as easily as a file on a server. Across town at the Ashcroft Crown Grand Ballroom, Vivian instructed the event coordinator to seat Daniel among minor vendors near the back, rather than at the strategic partners table, where the key deal's signatures would gather. Nathaniel suggested removing him from the guest list entirely, but Vivian wanted Daniel to feel the full weight of the company's scale up close, certain it would remind him how small his firm truly was. She believed, the way people often do right before being proven wrong, that opulence alone could bend a man's judgment. Meanwhile, Margaret Ashcroft, Vivian's mother and the quiet co-founder behind the name on the building, placed an unexpected call to her assistant asking for confirmation of one name on the evening's guest list, Daniel Marsh. That night, the grand lobby filled with investors, local officials, minor celebrities, and executives dressed for what was billed as a billion-dollar milestone. Daniel arrived alone in a charcoal suit, understated against the sea of designer gowns, and the woman at check-in read his name twice before believing he belonged on the strategic guest list.
A few executives recognized him, but avoided eye contact, having already been told by Vivian's office that he was a difficult vendor trying to inflate his price at the worst possible time. Renata Solis, the longtime banquet manager who'd worked Ashcroft Crown events for nearly 2 decades, was the only one who greeted him by name and personally walked him into the hall. The ballroom shimmered, chandeliers throwing pale gold light across polished marble, the scent of lilies mixing with perfume and warm bread near the string quartet. Daniel moved through it with the quiet detachment of a man who'd learned long ago that rooms like this were built to be admired, not trusted, and that the people inside often mistook comfort for character. Conversations paused slightly as he passed, not recognition, just polite confusion from guests trying to place a face that didn't match the usual crowd. It didn't bother him. He'd stopped needing rooms like this to validate his worth somewhere between a hospital waiting room and the first night he put his daughter abed alone. On the way through the service corridor, Daniel noticed an emergency exit partly blocked by a cart loaded with dinnerware, and without complaint helped Renata move it aside. She mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd filed a report about that exact obstruction months earlier and never received so much as an acknowledgement. Daniel began to understand that how Ashcroft Crown treated its own staff mirrored exactly how it treated every uncomfortable warning. Anything unpleasant simply got pushed out of view.
His name had originally been placed at table 2, beside the insurance representative and the deal's lead counsel, exactly where a man carrying the weight of a billion-dollar contract should sit. Minutes before guests took their seats, Vivian's assistant swapped his card for a major investor's, moving Daniel to table 14 near the swinging kitchen doors. Vivian walked past shortly after and feigned surprise at finding him there, saying with practiced ease that the head table was reserved for people who truly contributed to the company's future. Daniel replied, without raising his voice, that no future could be built on reports that had already been rewritten. Vivian's tone sharpened as she warned him not to bring business into a celebration, and he asked plainly whether she'd ever read the original safety reports or only the versions Nathaniel had handed her. For a brief second, something in her composure flickered before she covered it with the same cool detachment she wore like armor, still convinced Daniel was simply exaggerating to raise his price. Before stepping on stage, she quietly instructed the head of guest relations to make sure Daniel Marsh didn't appear in a single photo that night. Just before appetizers, Adrian Foster, the insurance company's senior representative, arrived and asked to sit beside Daniel to review certification paperwork together. Vivian realized then that pushing him to the back hadn't kept him from the people who actually mattered to the deal. She walked to table 14 in front of the room, announced a seating error, claimed the table had been reserved for investors, and told Daniel to move to the staff dining room instead. Renata tried to explain his name was clearly on the confirmed list, but Vivian cut her off and asked sharply whether she still wanted to keep her job. Then, turning back to Daniel with a smile meant for everyone nearby, she said a man who built systems for hotel workers might feel more at home eating with them. A ripple of uneasy laughter passed through nearby tables. Others looked down at their plates, unwilling to challenge a CEO at her own celebration. Vivian expected Daniel to raise his voice, to give her the excuse she needed to paint him as unprofessional and quietly cut him from the deal. Instead, he picked up his place card, looked at her steadily, and asked whether she wanted him gone because he didn't matter or because she was afraid of what he might say if he stayed. Daniel answered only that the people who truly needed him were already seated at the head table. Daniel didn't argue further. He thanked Renata, rose, and walked toward the staff area through a silence that settled over the room like a held breath. Nathaniel,
watching from across the ballroom, was certain Vivian had just won.
The staff dining room couldn't have looked more different from the hall Daniel had just left. Fluorescent light replaced chandeliers. The walls were bare except for a faded shift schedule and a corkboard cluttered with birthday cards and a lost and found notice. The smell was simpler too, roasted chicken and brewed coffee instead of lilies and champagne, and somehow the room felt more honest for it. Daniel was welcomed with folding chairs, simple plates, and a handful of employees grabbing a quick meal between shifts, none of whom cared about his net worth or what car he drove. Renata apologized for failing to protect him. Daniel told her plainly she had nothing to apologize for, that sharing a meal with working people was never something to be ashamed of. He set his jacket over his chair, rolled up his sleeves, and helped an older employee open a stubborn water bottle. Slowly, the tension eased. Marcus Webb, a maintenance technician who'd kept the hotel's aging systems running for years, spotted the Marsh Grid Systems logo on Daniel's folder and asked whether he was the engineer who'd once written a report on the basement electrical system. Daniel confirmed it. Marcus explained the report had triggered concern from 3 separate managers before quietly disappearing from the company database weeks later. He'd kept his own copies of the original maintenance logs all along, worried that someday blame for a failure no one had fixed would land on the workers who'd warned about it first. Then Marcus pulled out his phone and showed Daniel a photo he'd saved for months, Nathaniel Cross's own signature, approving a note that read plainly, "Delete before the assessment." His hands trembled slightly, not from fear of Daniel, but from years of frustration finally finding somewhere to land. He'd raised the basement wiring issue 3 separate times through proper channels, each time watching his concerns folded into paperwork that made the danger sound smaller. He had a wife at home and 2 grown sons in construction, and had told himself for years that speaking up too loudly would cost him a pension he'd spent 2 decades earning. Daniel listened without interrupting, the way he always did when someone finally found the courage to say what they'd swallowed for too long, and told Marcus plainly that no report should ever have to survive that many rewrites to be believed. Inside the ballroom, Vivian began her keynote about the Ashcroft family, insisting every employee was the true heart of the company, polished sentiment sitting uneasily beside the fact that she just sent a certifying engineer to eat with the staff and threatened a loyal manager in the same breath. Margaret arrived late, without warning her daughter, and reached the back of the hall just in time to catch the tail end of it. When she learned Daniel had been moved to the staff dining room, she didn't walk toward the head table prepared in her honor. Instead, she crossed the ballroom, pushed open the service door, and stepped into the small room behind the kitchen where Daniel sat among the people who kept Ashcroft Crown running every day. Vivian, still mid-speech, glanced at a nearby monitor and saw her mother's image on the internal security feed, standing in a room never meant to hold anyone important. Margaret didn't ask anyone to stand or make way. She simply pulled out a folding chair beside Daniel and asked, in a voice that carried further than she probably intended, whether there was still room at that table for people who told the truth. For a long moment, nobody in the cramped room moved. Renata stood frozen with a tray against her hip. Marcus set down his fork mid-bite, watching the founder of Ashcroft Crown settle into a folding chair as if it were the most natural seat in the building. Margaret smoothed her skirt once, the way a woman does when she's fully aware of the picture she's making and doesn't intend to apologize for it. A member of the event's media team, trailing her out of habit, caught the moment on a phone, and within minutes the image had spread quietly through the ballroom, guest to guest, whisper to whisper. Daniel realized only then that Margaret was the same woman who'd hired Marsh Grid Systems 3 months earlier under her maiden name, Margaret Doyle,
precisely because she'd already suspected the company's internal reports weren't what they seemed. She hadn't wanted to alarm her daughter without proof, so she'd waited quietly for the truth to surface on its own. Daniel had never connected the two names and understood in that instant he hadn't been invited to the gala by accident. Margaret herself had placed him on the strategic partners list. Vivian hurried into the staff room, masking panic behind a practiced smile, insisting the seating had simply been mishandled, urging her mother back to the head table. Margaret asked plainly who had given the order to move Daniel down here. Vivian dodged, claiming he was creating unnecessary trouble for a deal that mattered to the whole company. Margaret looked at her daughter and said only that she'd just turned this small room into the most important table in the building, and then asked for her own dinner to be brought down as well. One by one, board members, lead counsel, and Adrian Foster himself began drifting out of the ballroom to see what was happening, until the head table sat half empty, while the staff dining room grew steadily more crowded. Adrian finally spoke the words that made Vivian's stomach drop, announcing in front of everyone that his company would not underwrite the Lakeshore acquisition without Daniel Marsh's signature on the final certification. It was only then Vivian understood Daniel had never come to beg for anything. Marsh Grid Systems held the exclusive license for Guardian Mesh, and no competing firm on Earth could install a comparable system within the timeline Ashcroft Crown had already promised investors. Without his certification before midnight, the deal's financial terms would expire entirely, costing the company tens of millions in forfeited deposits and likely damaging its stock overnight. Vivian accused him of holding the company hostage for personal gain. Daniel calmly retrieved the contract she'd handed him that morning and pointed out, item by item, that Ashcroft Crown wanted to buy his patents below their worth, dismiss the maintenance staff who understood the buildings best, and have him certify properties as safe before repairs were even finished. He wasn't asking for a single extra dollar, only that the company complete the safety commitments it had already made in writing. Vivian argued that every major deal required compromise. Daniel answered that compromise meant both sides gave something up, while what she wanted was for him to surrender his conscience so she could keep her announcement on schedule.
Margaret asked Marcus to share what he knew. Though he hesitated, afraid of losing his position, Daniel didn't pressure him, reminding him the choice was his alone. That quiet respect stood in sharp contrast to everything Vivian had shown that night, and it wasn't lost on the people watching. Marcus finally opened his personal archive, revealing dozens of altered incident reports, along with an email from Nathaniel's office explicitly requesting certain risk ratings be changed before submission. Nathaniel tried to dismiss Marcus as a technician who didn't understand high-level strategy, but rather than defend her own employee, Vivian turned and asked Marcus why he'd kept internal company files on a personal device at all, a reaction that told every board member exactly where her priorities sat, more focused on who exposed the truth than on the truth itself. Naomi Reyes, the company's chief counsel, warned that if the documents were genuine, Ashcroft Crown might have unknowingly given false safety assurances to both underwriters and investors, a liability far greater than any delayed announcement. Vivian asked everyone to return to the ballroom, promising the matter would be handled privately. Margaret refused outright, pointing out that Daniel's humiliation had happened in full view of the entire gala, and the truth deserved the same openness. Then she revealed something Vivian hadn't been prepared to hear.
The board had planned to vote that same evening on extending her contract as CEO for another term. Margaret instructed the board secretary to bring the relevant files down to the staff dining room, and within minutes, folding chairs, a vending machine, and a modest laminate table became the site of the most consequential meeting in Ashcroft Crown's recent history. It was a striking image, executives in formal wear, crowded around furniture they'd likely never noticed on an ordinary day, cufflinks resting against a table scarred with years of coffee rings and hurried lunches. One board member, still holding a champagne flute out of habit, seemed unsure whether to set it down or keep it as proof this was in fact still an Ashcroft Crown event. Naomi opened her folder against the sticky tabletop without complaint, more focused on the documents than the unfamiliar setting. For all its plainness, the room held a gravity none of the marble corridors upstairs had ever quite managed. Vivian tried to reclaim control, insisting her mother was acting out of emotion, manipulated by a man with something to gain. Margaret asked Daniel to step outside so the family and board could speak freely, and Daniel agreed immediately, a small gesture proving he'd never tried to use his connection to her for leverage. In the hallway, Renata asked why he hadn't pushed for a far higher price given everything he now knew. Daniel told her that if he turned people's safety into a weapon for revenge against Vivian, he'd be no better than the people who'd put those people at risk in the first place.
Inside, Naomi confirmed Margaret still controlled the family trust, holding enough voting power to demand a special investigation into the company's practices. Nathaniel tried convincing Vivian to place all responsibility on the engineering department, but she was beginning to sense he might have hidden far more than he'd ever admitted. An email surfaced showing Vivian herself had once been warned a safety report could delay the deal's closing and had responded that no delay would be tolerated under any circumstances. She'd never explicitly ordered anyone to falsify a document, yet she'd built an environment where everyone beneath her understood that inconvenient truths weren't welcome near her timeline. The board voted to suspend Nathaniel's authority immediately and freeze his access to company systems while the investigation proceeded. When Daniel was invited back in, Vivian assumed her mother intended to press him into signing to save the company from collapse. Instead, Margaret simply asked how long proper repairs would actually take if done correctly and safely. He laid out a 30-day plan, property by property, acknowledging some sections would need to close temporarily and that the original maintenance staff would need to stay employed throughout. He spoke without notes, each phase building logically on the last, so that even board members unfamiliar with electrical systems could follow the shape of the work ahead. Naomi took notes quickly, glancing at Margaret to gauge her reaction, while Adrian nodded along, clearly relieved a workable path now existed where none seemed possible an hour earlier. The cost was significant, but nowhere near what the company would lose if the acquisition collapsed outright. Vivian objected, worried the delay would cost her the triumphant announcement she'd planned for the press. Margaret asked quietly, but without softness, whether she wanted to save the company or simply save her own image. Before the meeting could move forward, Daniel raised a concern that silenced the room again. Portions of the Guardian Mesh interface had already appeared in Ashcroft Crown's internal materials, despite the fact that Daniel had never issued a license for its use. Nathaniel had quietly hired an outside firm to replicate the visual interface of Daniel's system for a private investor demonstration, a shell version displaying convincing alerts on a screen without ever connecting to real sensors in the buildings.
Vivian had watched that very demonstration weeks earlier and walked away believing Ashcroft Crown no longer needed Daniel at all, which explained the confidence behind every dismissive word she'd aimed at him that night. Nathaniel tried shifting blame to the subcontractor, but digital signatures and a clear payment trail proved he'd personally approved the imitation system from start to finish. Vivian realized with slow and uncomfortable clarity that Nathaniel had spent months feeding her own arrogance, convincing her Daniel was merely a vendor chasing a bigger paycheck, while he quietly buried evidence of his own fraud. Margaret refused to let her daughter cast herself entirely as a victim, reminding her that Nathaniel may have lied, but Vivian was the one who'd chosen to trust a flatterer over the man who'd brought her uncomfortable truths from the beginning. Vivian stood very still, watching Nathaniel gather his things under building security's quiet supervision, and something in the sight unsettled her more than she expected. She'd trusted him nearly a decade, promoted him twice, defended him once in front of the very board now voting to remove him. It occurred to her, standing in that fluorescent-lit room, that she'd never once asked him to show her the raw data behind his numbers, only the polished version that always arrived exactly when she needed good news. She'd mistaken his confidence for competence, and now wondered how many other decisions she'd made the same way.
Vivian asked to speak with Daniel alone. In the corridor, she offered to triple the value of his original contract if he'd sign a temporary certification before midnight, promising real repairs would follow quietly afterward. Daniel refused without hesitation. She shifted quickly to threats, warning that Ashcroft Crown had more than enough attorneys to keep Marsh grid systems tied up in litigation for years. Daniel remained unmoved, telling her copies of every document had already gone to his attorney that afternoon, and the insurance company had received formal notice to preserve all related evidence. Vivian's voice had lost the polish it carried earlier. For the first time all night, Daniel saw something closer to a frightened executive than a woman certain of her own power. She glanced back toward the ballroom doors, as if the crowd behind them might somehow rescue her from a conversation she no longer controlled. There was no longer a way to buy him, threaten him, or isolate him into submission, and something in her expression finally cracked under that realization. Daniel told her, without cruelty, but without softening the truth, that she'd assumed he was weak because he arrived alone that night. Yet she herself had stood in a room full of hundreds of people and still couldn't find a single one willing to tell her the truth. When they returned to the main gathering, Adrian informed the room the certification deadline couldn't be extended. If Daniel didn't sign, the entire announcement would have to be canceled on the spot. Daniel formally declined. From the ballroom beyond the doors, Vivian could hear the master of ceremonies beginning to introduce what he still believed would be a historic announcement, a triumph she now knew no longer existed. She was forced to walk back onto the stage where she'd planned to celebrate the largest deal of her career, and instead tell the room the announcement would be postponed while the company reviewed certain technical conditions more carefully. Camera flashes that had waited all evening for a triumphant photograph instead caught the flicker of uncertainty crossing her face, a small human crack in a night built entirely around the appearance of control. Investors immediately pressed for details, and Vivian struggled to hold her composure as the truth she'd spent all evening suppressing finally slipped past her control. Margaret followed her onto the stage and told the room the company would launch an independent investigation into its safety reporting and governance practices. She offered no details designed to humiliate her daughter publicly,
but confirmed clearly that leadership had failed to take important warnings seriously. The board convened an emergency session that same night, suspending Vivian from her role as CEO pending the investigation's outcome, while Nathaniel was terminated outright for document fraud and misuse of intellectual property that didn't belong to him. Margaret didn't reclaim permanent control of the company for herself. She agreed only to serve as interim chair until a new CEO could be properly selected.
Daniel was offered a seat at the head table once the announcements concluded, and he declined, choosing instead to return to the staff dining room to finish the meal interrupted hours earlier. Adrian, Naomi, and 2 board members followed without a second thought. The very table Vivian had used to diminish him had become the place where the company's recovery was actually being discussed, chair by folding chair. Vivian stood near the doorway, watching her mother, several board members, and the people who mattered most that night gathered around a table she'd once considered beneath her notice. For the first time, she understood she'd never pushed Daniel away from power at all. She'd only pushed herself away from the place where real power had quietly been forming the entire time. Margaret didn't invite her daughter in right away, letting her stand there a moment longer, feeling the same isolation she'd tried so carelessly to force onto Daniel earlier that night. Daniel glanced toward the doorway, saw Vivian standing there, and chose not to make her suffer for it. Instead, he simply pulled out an empty chair and waited to see whether she had the courage to walk through the door. Vivian stepped into the staff dining room without an assistant, a camera, or a title standing between her and the people she'd spent the evening dismissing. She apologized to Daniel for using his role as a single father as leverage, and for turning a simple meal with hard-working employees into something meant to shame him. Daniel didn't forgive her instantly, and made no effort to embarrass her further in front of the others. He told her plainly that an apology only meant something if the people she'd dismissed noticed a real change once the night was over. Her voice caught slightly as she said it, the practiced smoothness of every prior speech that night finally giving way to something plainer, less rehearsed. Renata didn't rush to comfort her, and Marcus simply nodded once, the way a man does when an apology arrives a little late, but isn't, for that reason, worthless. Vivian turned to Renata and Marcus and admitted quietly that she'd spent years treating her own staff as instruments of operation rather than the people who understood the company better than anyone in a boardroom ever could.
Margaret laid out the conditions under which her daughter might eventually return to leadership position at Ashcroft Crown. She would need to step away from executive authority for at least a full year and work directly within the operational teams overseeing repairs at the affected properties. She would carry no executive title, no private office, and would answer instead to the engineering team and the local hotel managers she'd once looked down upon without a second thought. Daniel signed a new agreement with Ashcroft Crown only after the board accepted every safety condition in full, agreeing to retain the original maintenance staff and formally protect the employees who'd come forward with evidence. He didn't sell his patents. Marsh Grid Systems remained independent, fairly compensated for the value it had always carried. 3 months later, the first renovated resort reopened to the public, meeting every safety standard Daniel had originally outlined, and not a single employee had lost a job in the process. The lobby smelled faintly of fresh paint and cedar, sunlight falling across newly polished floors where months earlier tarps and exposed wiring had lined the halls. Guests moved freely through spaces quietly and carefully rebuilt from the ground up, unaware how close the property had once come to opening with the same hidden dangers Daniel had first flagged. Renata was promoted to oversee operational training across the company's properties, while Marcus became head of an independent safety oversight team, answering directly to the board rather than any single executive. At the reopening ceremony, Daniel got a call from Nora asking when exactly everything had begun to change. He looked out at the simple dining table where staff and new leadership now sat together without separation, and answered that it had started the moment one woman with enough power finally chose to sit down, and everyone else in the room was finally forced to listen. Sunlight came through tall windows overlooking the water, catching the steam rising off mugs of coffee passed casually from hand to hand along the table. No one waiting to be served, no one standing apart. Somewhere down the row, Renata laughed at something Adrian said, and Marcus leaned back in his chair, entirely at ease in a room that once made him feel invisible. Daniel thought, watching it all unfold, that this was closer to what his wife had always believed a company should feel like, long before either of them had ever heard the name Ashcroft Crown. It wasn't the size of the building or the height of its ceilings that made a place worth trusting. It was whether the people inside were willing to sit down together when it actually mattered. The story closes on an image of Margaret pulling a chair beside Daniel once again, just as she had on the night of the gala. Except this time, there was no head table reserved for the powerful, and no separate room set aside for everyone else. There was only one long table, stretching the length of the room, with enough seats for anyone willing to tell the truth.